Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, let us turn our gaze to where the Nile carves a lifeline through a land of golden stone and red desert. To Nubia, to the kingdom of Kush and its mighty southern heart, the city of Meroë. Here, pyramids stand as silent sentinels against a vast sky. But our story is not held in stone. It flickers, it dances, it consumes and is consumed. Our story is held in fire. In the great temple of Apodmak, the lion-headed god of war and fertility, there burned a flame. This wasn't a flame for light, nor for sacrifice in the usual sense. This was the eternal flame of Meroë. For 800 years, through the reign of 40 kings, through seasons of drought and flood, through trade and turmoil, it was never allowed to die. Its keepers were a hereditary line of priests. But they were more than priests. They were historians. They believed, with an unshakable conviction, that fire was the most reliable witness to time. That a flame, if tended with perfect attention, could become the living memory of a people. These Nubian fire priests understood flame in three sacred aspects. First, as a witness, it saw everything offered to it, every prayer whispered before it, every moment of joy or despair in the temple's grand hall. Second, as a historian, it transformed what it witnessed, the wood, the oils, the ceremonial objects, into a new substance, ash, and this ash, they believed, held the very essence of the events it consumed. And third, as a purifier, it burned away falsehood, leaving only the condensed truth of an era preserved in layered cinders. These guardians were known as the keepers of ash and amber, protectors of a history written not on papyrus scrolls, but in the fragile, layered dust of centuries. The dedication required was immense. Imagine a lineage of families, generation after generation, whose sole purpose was to feed a single fire. They sourced specific woods for specific ceremonies, knowing that the resulting ash would tell a different story. Siseb, wood for royal occasions, acacia for harvest festivals. They recorded everything: the wood type, the oils used, the items consumed by the flame. All were noted, creating a cross-reference for the ash itself. The temple became a center of constant, focused activity, all revolving around this single, sacred task. Tonight, we will enter the smoky, sacred space of their vigil. We will learn the profound covenant of the eternal flame and the immense logistical and spiritual effort required to keep a fire alive for so long. We will explore their astonishing ash archives, where history was read in the color, texture, and even the scent of preserved cinders. A reddish layer might speak of a season of war and bloodshed, a fine white ash of a prosperous year of peace. We will witness the terrifying moment the flame itself spoke, turning a prophetic, unnatural green to warn of an impending invasion, a warning that went unheeded with tragic consequences for the kingdom. And finally, our journey will lead us to the present day. We will join modern archaeologists as they uncover these very ash records, sparking a fierce debate that bridges ancient intuition and modern science. Can history truly be stored in something as ephemeral as dust? Can spectral analysis of these ancient ashes reveal the secrets of a lost kingdom? The findings are forcing us to ask profound questions about how we record our own past. This is a story about permanence and fragility. It challenges our notion that memory must be solid, carved in stone, or built to last forever. The Nubians placed their trust in a processor, constant, vigilant act of tending a transformation. They believed that true history was not a static monument, but a continuous burning, a conversation between the consumed past and the consuming present. As we begin this journey, let us imagine the heat on the skin, the smell of sacred Siseb wood, the hypnotic dance of the flame. and the profound silence of the keepers, listening to the stories the fire told as it burned. Let's pause for a moment. The fire crackles gently as the night breathes around us. Our own small, friendly fire is an echo of that great, eternal one. A tiny cousin, holding its own small memory of the evening in its glowing heart. Join us as we uncover the secrets of the eternal flame of Meroë. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss this incredible story. Imagine a world where the most catastrophic event isn't the death of a king, but the extinguishing of a single flame. A world where a kingdom's very soul, its memory, its future, is tied to the constant, flickering light of an eternal fire. This was the reality for the Nubians of Meroë. By the end of our journey today, you'll understand why a simple flame held more power than any crown, and how its light was a sacred pact, binding an entire civilization as fate. Our story begins not with human hands, but with a dramatic act of nature. In the earliest days of Meroë, within the freshly built temple of Apedmark, a seasonal storm of immense power raged. Rain lashed down, the wind howled, and then a blinding flash. A bolt of lightning, a spear thrown from the heavens, struck the central altar, but it didn't shatter the stone. Instead, it ignited a pyre of ritual oils and sacred unguents, laid out for a ceremony. A fire erupted, not an ordinary fire, but a blaze so pure, so fierce, it seemed to burn without consuming. The priests, stunned and awestruck, saw it for what it was, a divine sign. The lion-headed god Apedmark had gifted them his own breath, his own eye, a piece of celestial certainty now anchored in their earthly temple. This was no ordinary flame to be used and doused at will. This was Apedmark's enduring presence. As the fire danced and crackled, the first high priest, a man named Alara, knelt before its white-hot heart. In front of the newly crowned king and the gathered people of Meroë, he made a covenant, a vow that would echo down through the centuries, shaping the destiny of his nation. He raised his hands to the heavens, and his voice rang out through the grand hall. This flame, he declared, is the breath of our beginning. It has seen our foundation. As long as it burns, Meroë remembers itself. Its light is our consciousness. Its heat is our vitality. Should it ever fail, the thread of our days will snap. We will become a people who have forgotten their own dreams. Then, his voice dropping to a solemn promise, he vowed, "I swear that this fire shall never die. My sons shall tend it, and their sons after them, until the very stones of this temple return to the desert sand." This single act established the founding philosophy of the kingdom. The flame was not merely symbolic, it was synonymous with their historical continuity. It was the kingdom's active, living memory. Think about it. Stone carvings could be defaced. Scrolls and papyrus could rot or be burned. But this fire was a living process. It demanded constant, conscious engagement from its tenders. To keep it alive was to actively participate in the act of remembering. To let it die was to choose collective amnesia, to sever the link between the past, present, and future. The fire became a perpetual engine of history. It consumed the present moment in the form of carefully selected wood. Sacred offerings, whispered prayers, and transformed it into two things: light, representing the immediate experience, the vibrant now, and ash, the settled history, the residue of what had been. The flame was constantly converting now into then, and the keepers of the flame were its crucial, indispensable mechanics. This reality elevated a single duty above all others. The most sacred role in the entire kingdom was not that of the king, but of the keeper of the flame. A king ruled the territory, managed armies, and dealt with politics. But the keeper tended the timeline. A king could be deposed, a dynasty could fall, but the lineage of the keepers could not be broken. Their family compound was physically attached to the temple, a testament to their inseparable bond. Their lives were not regulated by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the fire's constant needs. Day and night, their existence revolved around feeding, cleaning, and protecting the sacred blaze. They were a people set apart, deeply revered, yet burdened with a responsibility that weighed more than any crown. Their success, their entire life's purpose, was measured by a single, simple, and terrifying metric. The flame must never, ever go out. The covenant made by Alara created a beautiful, yet terrifying, dependency. The entire identity of a powerful civilization was literally fueled by a physical phenomenon. This profound belief shaped every aspect of Nubian spirituality, centering it on the concepts of continuity and witness. Every major event of state was conducted in the presence of the flame. When a new king was crowned, he stood before the fire so it would see and record his ascent. When a treaty was signed with a neighboring power, the pact was made in the light of the flame, binding it with divine authority. When an army marched to war, the generals and soldiers departed from the temple, their campaign witnessed by the eternal eye of Apetmark. The fire was the ultimate notary public, its flickering light the pen with which the history of Meroë was signed. The keepers, in turn, were the scribes of this fiery, living text. Their training began in childhood, not with letters and numbers, but with the relentless, practical science of preventing the unthinkable. They learned the properties of different woods. Ones burned longest, which burned cleanest. They learned how to manage airflow, how to clean the great bronze brazier without disturbing the core of the fire, and how to anticipate the effects of weather on the temple's drafts. Their first and most important lesson was a chilling one: how to prevent a single moment of darkness. Because in that darkness, a kingdom would lose its memory, its identity, its very soul. This wasn't just a religious ritual. It was a deeply ingrained psychological and cultural mechanism. The continuous act of tending the fire was a constant, physical reminder of their origins, their history, and their obligations to the future. Every log added was an affirmation of their identity. Every prayer whispered into the heat was a renewal of their pact with the divine. The people of Meroë didn't just believe the fire was their history. They actively participated in its preservation every single day. The king might have held the scepter of power, but it was the keeper, with soot on his hands and the glow of the fire in his eyes, who held the timeline of a nation. He wasn't just watching a fire. He was keeping a civilization's heart beating. Think about the pressure. A single mistake, a moment of distraction, a sudden illness, and centuries of history could be wiped out. The keepers were more than priests. They were technicians of the sacred, guardians of a nation's consciousness. Their lineage was a living bridge, connecting the founding of Meroë to its present, one log, one prayer, one watchful night at a time. The sound of the crackling fire wasn't just a comforting ambience in the temple. It was the sound of a kingdom's memory, alive and well. It was the sound of survival, of continuity, of a promise made in the face of a lightning strike. A promise kept through generations against the encroaching darkness. And, as we'll see, the fear of what would happen if that sound ever stopped was the most powerful force in the land of the Nubian kings. Have you ever wondered what it takes to keep a promise? Not just for a day or a year, but for centuries. In the ancient Nubian kingdom of Meroë, they didn't just make a promise, they kept it burning. For 800 years, a single, sacred flame never went out. This wasn't just a spiritual vow. It was an incredible feat of engineering, ritual, and unwavering societal commitment. A masterpiece of practical devotion. So, how did they do it? The story begins not with fire, but with wood. The fuel for this eternal flame couldn't be just any log. It had to be special. It came from a sacred grove of siseb trees, a type of hardy desert acacia that grew in a protected valley a full day's journey from the city. These trees weren't public property. They belonged exclusively to the temple, their existence intertwined with the flame itself. Harvesting this wood wasn't a chore. It was a deeply spiritual ceremony. A designated keeper would journey to the grove, carrying a single axe made of bronze. There, in the quiet of the early morning, with light filtering through the sparse leaves, they wouldn't just chop down a tree. No, that would be sacrilege. They would carefully select a single, mature branch, ensuring the tree itself would continue to live and thrive. Before the axe ever touched the bark, the keeper would speak words of gratitude and even apology to the tree's spirit. It was a partnership, a respectful taking, not a conquest of nature. Once the branch was cut, it was transported back to Meroë on the back of a pure white donkey, an animal kept and revered solely for this sacred task. Back at the temple, the wood's journey wasn't over. It was brought to a special stone chamber, meticulously designed to be dry and well ventilated. Here, the wood would season, becoming the perfect, slow-burning fuel the eternal flame required. The flame itself lived within a massive bronze brazier. But this wasn't like your backyard fire pit. It had a deep bed of sand and ash, a clever design to insulate the hot coals and keep them glowing for as long as possible. And that bed of ash was never fully cleaned out. It was considered part of the flame's memory, its history, its very foundation. It held the essence of every fire that had burned before. Keeping this flame alive was a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job. The responsibility fell to a dedicated order of keepers who worked in constant relays. There was never a moment when the flame was unwatched. At all times, day or night, a keeper was there, sitting in silent vigil. The changing of the guard was a ritual in itself, a silent, powerful transfer of immense responsibility. The incoming keeper would approach the sacred fire and bow. Then they would turn and bow to the seated keeper. No words were ever exchanged. The one whose watch was ending would simply rise, place a hand on the shoulder of their replacement, and then walk away. In that single touch, the weight of 8 centuries was past. The vigil continued, unbroken. This constant, quiet dedication was the daily rhythm of the flame. But the greatest moment of danger, the event that filled the entire city with a collective, anxious tension, came only once in a generation. It was the day the flame had to be moved. Over decades, even the massive bronze brazier would wear out, its metal fatiguing from the constant heat. It had to be replaced. This wasn't a simple swap. It was a grand ceremony, a moment where the kingdom's past and future hung in the balance. A new, identical brazier would be forged and consecrated. It was then placed right beside the old one. For 3 days and 3 nights leading up to the transfer, the 2 braziers were connected by a bridge of fire. A special, long-burning log of siseb heartwood was lit from the old flame and kept burning in the space between them. It was a physical link, ensuring the flame's essence was never broken, even for a moment. Finally, on the dawn of the 4th day, the entire royal court would assemble. The king, the priests, the nobles all would gather in the pre-dawn stillness, their eyes fixed on the 2 braziers. This was the moment of truth. The High Keeper, his face a mask of intense concentration, would step forward. He would hold a pair of tongs made of pure silver, a metal believed to be pure and resistant to corruption. He would reach into the old brazier, into that ancient bed of ash and embers, and carefully, so carefully, select a single, perfect, glowing coal. Everyone would hold their breath. The only sound would be the gentle crackle of the fire. He would then lift the ember, carrying it across the small gap to the new brazier. The entire history of Meroë, 1,000 years of memory and identity, was balanced right there. suspended in a pair of silver tongs, held by the steady hand of one man. He would gently place the coal into the prepared bed of the new brazier and then feed it with the burning bridge log. The city waited. If the new flame caught, if it burned bright and strong, a collective sigh of relief would ripple through the crowd, through the entire city. The timeline was secure. The covenant was renewed. The old brazier, its long service complete, would then be ritually broken, and its pieces buried within the temple's foundations, becoming a permanent part of the sacred ground it had served. Let's just pause here for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine that scene. The pre-dawn chill, the flickering light of the flames, the silent, watchful faces of the king and his court. And at the center of it all, one man, the High Keeper, performing the most delicate and critical task imaginable. A single glowing ember, the living heart of a civilization, making its perilous journey from the old to the new. The weight of every ancestor, every victory, every story, rested on the steadiness of his hand and the focus of his will. It's a powerful image, a testament to how deeply this ritual was woven into the fabric of their world. It wasn't just about keeping a fire going. It was about ensuring that their very identity, their connection to their own past, would continue to burn brightly for the next generation. This relentless, meticulous process wasn't just a temple secret. It infused the entire city of Meroë. The sensory experience of the kingdom was defined by this flame. The distinct cracking sound of the siseb wood as it burned, the unique smoky fragrance that drifted through the streets. The constant, reassuring glow visible in the temple gateway at night, these were the constants in a world that was always changing. The flame became the city's very pulse. Its unbroken burning was tangible proof that Meroë was still Meroë, that the promise made to their ancestors remained intact. In a world defined by the shifting desert sands and the unpredictable winds of politics and war, the eternal flame was the one thing that did not change. It was a psychological anchor. It provided a sense of stability, of permanence, of identity. Seeing the smoke rise, smelling its scent on the breeze, knowing that the keepers were on watch, Chit was a daily reassurance that all was as it should be. The fire burned. Therefore, they remembered. Therefore, they were it. It was the ultimate expression of the idea that to know who you are, you must never forget where you came from. The flame wasn't just a symbol of their past. It was the living, breathing, burning engine of their present. We're not just exploring a ruin or deciphering a forgotten text. We are stepping into a profound philosophical world. One where the entire concept of time, memory, and history was embodied by a single living entity, the eternal flame of Meroë. Imagine a temple. At its center, a fire that has not been extinguished for centuries. To an outsider, it might seem like a simple act of devotion. But for the people of this Kushite kingdom, this flame was everything. The true duty of the keepers, the guardians of this fire, was not merely to prevent its physical extinction. Their role was far deeper. They were nurturing a philosophical understanding that permeated every aspect of life. To the priests and the people, the eternal flame was the kingdom's very soul made visible. It was a living, breathing model of their concept of time and identity. They didn't see existence as a straight line, but as a continuous, dynamic process of transformation, of energy constantly changing form. The flame was this principle in its purest, most perfect state. Think about it. The flame consumes the tangible present, the sacred siseb wood, the fragrant oils, the offerings of grain and wine. It takes what is solid and real right now and transforms it. It becomes the intangible light and heat of the immediate experience, and also the tangible residue of ash, the settled dust of memory. In this worldview, every present moment is an offering, fed into the fire of time. It first becomes the brilliant, immediate light of lived experience, and then it cools and settles into the form of history, of memory. The flame was the very engine of this conversion. Its constant hunger was the hunger of history itself, always needing to be fed with the fuel of now to produce the light of understanding and the ash of record. This is why the thought of the flame dying was so terrifying. It wasn't just about losing a symbol. Extinction meant amnesia. If the flame went out, the entire process would stop. The conversion of the present into the past would be fatally interrupted. The people would find themselves trapped in an eternal, disconnected now, with no way to turn their experiences into a collective memory, a shared history. They would live, yes, but they would not accumulate wisdom. They would have events, but no story. The vast archives of ash, each jar representing a period of their history, would cease to grow. The kingdom would become a body without a mind, a river without a riverbed, flowing wildly and chaotically, but leaving no fertile delta of culture and knowledge behind. The keepers taught that every single piece of wood fed to the flame was a day in the life of Meroë. They weren't just tending a fire, they were reading a living document. The quality of the smoke, the vibrant color of the flame, the texture and character of the ash, all of these were seen as direct reflections of the kingdom's spiritual and material state. It was a national barometer. In years of bountiful harvests and just, wise rule, the siseb wood was said to burn with a clear, almost pure, golden flame, leaving behind a fine, white ash. But in times of tension, drought, or social unrest, the wood might seem to resist the fire. The flame might sputter and choke, producing thick, dark smoke and leaving a coarse, black residue. The fire was a direct gauge of the national soul, and the keepers were its most skilled readers, its interpreters. So, the vigil kept by these guardians was never a passive act of watching. It was an active, constant interpretation. The keeper on duty was reading the flame with the same focus and skill that a scholar might read a sacred scroll. Is it burning steadily tonight? Or is it agitated, flickering wildly? Does it lean consistently in one direction? The very position and dance of the flame could be read as favor or disfavor from their lion-headed god, a sudden, bright flare, just as a petitioner spoke their prayer, might be seen as a sign of divine acknowledgement. A dimming of the flame when a certain high official approached the sanctum would be noted with grave concern. The fire was in a constant, silent dialogue with its environment, and the keepers were fluent in its flickering, voiceless language. Let's just pause for a moment here. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. The deep, quiet night of the Nubian desert. The gentle crackle of the fire, the scent of burning wood and ancient stone. Contemplate that profound idea, an entire civilization's understanding of itself. Its past, its present, its very identity, all tied to the behavior of a single fire. This wasn't simple superstition. It was a highly sophisticated metaphysical framework, one where the physical world and the historical narrative were seen as two states of the same essential energy. The flame was both the process that created history and the living record of it. This deep, integrated belief system meant that the keepers became the most trusted observers in the entire kingdom. They stood beyond politics. Their loyalty was not to a king or a faction, but only to the continuity of the flame and the truth it witnessed every single moment. Kings and queens would seek their counsel, not for military strategy or economic policy, but for something far more fundamental, a reading of the national temper as it was reflected in the fire's recent behavior. Were the people anxious? Was the land content? Was there a hidden sickness in the body politic? The keepers, through their intimate, daily communion with this living record, were believed to hold the very pulse of Meroë in their hands. as surely and as carefully as they held the iron tongs that fed its eternal heart. This bond between the flame and the kingdom created a unique form of governance and social cohesion. The pronouncements of the keepers, based on their readings, carried immense weight. If the flame signaled distress, it wasn't a cause for panic, but a call for introspection. The king, the priests, the people, law would look inward. Had a law been unjust? Had a ritual been neglected? Was there greed or corruption tainting the community? The fire acted as a moral compass and a catalyst for self-correction. It provided a feedback loop that was immediate, undeniable, and sacred. The training of a keeper was an incredibly long and arduous process, beginning in early childhood. It wasn't just about learning the practical skills of fire tending, how to select the wood, how to manage the airflow, how to safely remove the ash. The real education was in philosophy, in history, in observation. An apprentice had to learn to quiet their own mind, to become a clear vessel for observation, free from personal bias. They would spend thousands of hours simply watching, learning the flame's infinite moods and subtle shifts. They memorized the ash records, learning to correlate the texture of the ash with the historical events of that period, recorded in parallel on papyrus scrolls. They learned to sense the subtle changes in the air, the mood of the worshippers, and see how the flame responded. They were, in essence, scientists of the spirit, data analysts of the divine. The ash itself was meticulously collected, cooled, and stored in labeled clay jars, creating a physical library of time, an archive of yesterdays. A keeper could pull a jar from a shelf, a sample from a year of famine centuries ago, and compare its coarse, dark grit to the fine, pale ash of a golden age. They could literally feel their history in the palms of their hands. This tangible connection to the past gave the people of Meroë a powerful sense of continuity and identity. They weren't just living on the land of their ancestors. They were living in direct, unbroken continuity with their ancestors' experiences, a chain forged and maintained by the eternal fire. The end of this tradition, when it came, must have been an unimaginable cataclysm. With the decline of the Meroitic kingdom and the arrival of new beliefs, the flame was eventually extinguished. For the last keepers, this would have been more than a political defeat. It was the end of the world as they knew it. The engine of history had been silenced. The soul of the kingdom had departed. The river of time was now unchanneled, its memory unrecorded. It's a powerful and tragic metaphor for what happens when a culture loses its central narrative, its way of making sense of the world and its own place within it. The story of the eternal flame of Meroë reminds us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It is a living process, a story we tell ourselves to understand who we are. And sometimes that story is as fragile and as beautiful as a flame flickering in the dark. The system of memory, the great flame that held the stories of a people, was about to take its next profound leap. This change wouldn't come from a grand decree issued by a pharaoh or a high priest. It would not be the result of a council of wise men debating for weeks. Instead, it would arise from the quiet, patient observation of a single keeper, a man named Taharqa. For 40 years, Taharqa had tended the flame. He was a fixture in the temple, his life measured by the cycles of stoking the fire and clearing the ash. He had seen empires rise and fall in the dance of the embers. He had lived through a great plague that had stolen a generation. A brutal civil war that had pitted brother against brother, and a subsequent golden age of peace under a wise and beloved queen. His hands, though wrinkled and calloused, moved with a practiced grace that spoke of decades of devotion. One morning, as the first rays of dawn slanted through the high temple windows, Taharqa was performing his daily meditative task. He was carefully removing the excess ash from the great bronze brazier, ensuring the airflow remained perfect to keep the flame burning bright and clean. It was a chore he knew by heart, a rhythm of scrape and scoop. But on this day, he noticed something. Something he had seen 1,000 times, but never truly seen. The ash from the past week was different. It had been a week of joyous festivals, celebrating the Queen's Jubilee. The city had been alive with music, feasting, and laughter. The offerings to the flame had been rich perfumed woods, garlands of flowers, and sweet cakes. The ash that remained was light and fluffy, almost pure white. It drifted in his palm like captured moonlight. A flicker of memory, a long dormant curiosity, sparked in his mind. He walked to a shadowed corner of the temple annex, to a sealed storage chamber. Here, urns of ash from years past were kept. It was a practice that had begun during the Great Plague, a superstitious measure to isolate any unclean essence, to keep the miasma of that terrible time from tainting the present. He unsealed the large clay urn from the plague year. He plunged his hand into it. The difference was immediate and shocking. This ash was not light and soft. It was dense, heavy, and a dull, lifeless grey, and it felt cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temple's ambient warmth. It was the cold of sorrow, of loss. A thought, slow and monumental, began to form into Harker's mind, a concept so radical it almost felt like blasphemy. The fire did not just witness events. It did not just consume the offerings. It absorbed their very character. The ash was not just waste, not just the spent remnants of the wood. The ash was a transcript. It was a physical record of the emotional and spiritual climate of the time it was created. The fire was an alchemical furnace, turning history into substance. This revelation consumed him. He had to know more. He had to test this theory. He began an experiment, one that would redefine the role of the keepers for all time. He went to the royal potters, artisans of unparalleled skill, and commissioned a set of identical ceramic urns. They were to be flawless, made from the finest Nile clay, and fired to a perfect, uniform standard. He gave the potters specific instructions. These urns were not to be labeled with words, for words could be misinterpreted, their meanings shifting over time. Instead, he had them scratch simple, evocative symbols into the wet clay before firing. A single, full sheaf of wheat for a year of bountiful harvest. 2 crossed spears for a year of war and conflict. A weeping eye, a single tear falling from it, for the year of the plague. A crown for the reign of a new monarch. A lotus flower for a year of peace and prosperity. Each symbol was a key, a direct link to the collective experience of that year. And so, his new ritual began. As the seasons turned and the great cycle of the Nile's flood came to its end, marking the close of another year, Harker would approach the great brazier with a new solemnity. With a specially crafted copper shovel, he would take a single, careful scoop of ash from the heart of the year's final fire. He would then walk to the growing row of urns and place the ash into the vessel marked for that year. He performed this act with the gravity of a high priest making an offering to the gods. He truly believed he was preserving the very essence of the year itself, its triumphs, its sorrows, its fears. Its moral climate condensed into a tangible, if fragile, form. At first, the other keepers were skeptical, even a little scornful. Their entire training had been about the purity of the flame. Ash was the byproduct, the spent, dead matter that had to be cleared away to make room for the new. "You are collecting dust, old man," one of the younger keepers had said. "You are building a library of endings." They saw his collection of urns as an eccentric folly, a strange obsession of a man who had spent too long staring into the fire. But Taharqa was patient. He had the quiet confidence of one who has glimpsed a deeper truth. He didn't argue or preach. He showed them. He would lead a doubtful keeper to his archive, the rows of urns now lining the stone shelves of a dedicated chamber. He would have them touch, have them experience the story the ash had to tell. "Feel this," he would say, holding out the open urn from the year of the Civil War. The ash was coarse, gritty. It felt sharp against the fingertips, like it was full of tiny, microscopic shards. "It is sharp," Taharqa would explain softly. "It pricks the skin. It holds the anger and the pain of that time." The keeper would pull their hand back, unnerved by the physical sensation of a historical memory. Then Taharqa would offer another urn, the one from the year of peace that followed the war, the year the treaties were signed and families were reunited. He would bid the keeper to touch that ash. "And this," he'd whisper, his voice full of reverence, "this is as soft as down. It is smooth. It holds the sigh of relief of an entire kingdom." And the keeper would feel it, the smooth, almost silky texture that seemed to soothe the skin. Slowly, one by one, they began to see. They began to understand. This was not the rambling of an old man. This was a revelation. This was the next evolution of their sacred duty. The ash was not the end of the story. It was the story itself, written in a language that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the senses. The archive was born. The library of endings had become a library of essences. What Taharqa had founded was not a science of chemical analysis as we would know it. There were no laboratories, no microscopes. It was a science of sensory empathy, a discipline of the heart and the hands. The keepers who followed him developed a refined tactile and visual literacy that was as complex and nuanced as any written language. They became connoisseurs of history's residue. They learned to read the ash. They discovered that ash from a year of great artistic flourishing, when poets and sculptors were celebrated, might have a slight, almost imperceptible sparkle. They theorized this came from the minute particles of malachite, lapis lazuli, or gold leaf that had been part of the ceremonial masks and painted scrolls offered to the flame in tribute. They could identify the ash from a year of drought and famine. It was tinged with a faint reddish-brown hue. It held the ghost of the desperate, wind-blown topsoil that had settled on everything in the kingdom, from the peasant's hut to the sacred wood piled high for the temple fire. To touch it was to feel the grit of desperation. To smell it was to catch the phantom scent of dust and despair. The archive had become a multi-sensory record of the life of their civilization. The keepers became the nation's empaths. When the pharaoh's advisors debated a new law, they would consult the keepers. "Show us the ash from the last time a tax like this was levied," they might ask, and the keepers would bring the urn, allowing the advisors to feel the brittle, angry texture of the populace's resentment, a silent but potent warning from the past. When a new peace treaty was proposed, the keepers would bring forth the soft ash of reconciliation and the sharp ash of broken promises, offering a tangible lesson in the consequences of their choices. History was no longer an abstract tale told by storytellers. It was a physical presence, a weight in the palm, a texture against the skin, a color to the eye. It was real, it was present, and it could be consulted. And all of it, this entire revolutionary leap in understanding memory and history, began with one old man who took the time to truly look at the dust he was sweeping away. Over the generations that followed, Taharqa's powerful intuition was not just remembered, it was refined, systematized, and transformed into a complex, teachable language. This was the birth of the Ash Archives, a library unlike any other in the world. It wasn't filled with scrolls or tablets, but with countless urns, each holding the dust of a single year. To manage this extraordinary collection, a new position was created, the Master Reader, standing just below the High Keeper in the kingdom's hierarchy. This priest had a singular, sacred duty to study the archives, maintain their integrity, and, most importantly, interpret their silent stories for the kingdom. The language they developed, the language of ash, was as intricate as it was profound. Its vocabulary began with color, the most immediate and telling clue. Snow-white ash, light and pure, spoke of years of peace, prosperity, and benevolent rule. This was the ash of contentment, the ideal that every ruler strived for. Then there was charcoal grey, the color of mediocrity. It signified years of stagnation, mild discontent among the people, or simply periods of uninspired administrative dullness. At the other end of the spectrum was a coarse, jet-black ash. This was the ash of conflict, a stark record of violence, brutal wars, or great social injustice that had torn the kingdom apart. But the earth had its own voice in this history. A reddish-brown ash told of struggles with the land itself, years of devastating drought, failed harvests, and famine. It was the color of earthly hardship. And then there were the truly special years, marked by a pale grey ash that seemed to glitter with countless tiny sparkles. This was the ash of great cultural or spiritual achievement, of grand celebrations and moments of collective inspiration that lifted the entire kingdom. Imagine a master reader, their weathered hands holding 5 small ceramic dishes, each containing a different sample. The pure white, the dull grey, the stark black, the earthy red, and the shimmering, sparkling grey. A whole spectrum of history held in the palm of their hand. If color was the vocabulary of this language, then texture was its grammar, adding layers of syntax and meaning. A fine, silky powder between the fingers spoke of stability, of careful and calm governance, where the machinery of state ran smoothly. A gritty, sandy texture, however, hinted at friction and unease. It revealed years of uncertainty, unresolved tensions simmering beneath the surface, or alliances shifting like desert sands. Some ash felt different still. A clumpy, almost damp-feeling ash pointed to years dominated by powerful collective emotion, be it profound, shared grief after a tragedy, or explosive, unified joy after a great victory. And then there was the flaky, layered ash, which told of years with complex, multifaceted events, where different stories unfolded simultaneously, each leaving its distinct layer in the final record. And there was one more, almost mystical element. Scent. It was a faint, ghostly aroma that lingered in the sealed urns, a final whisper of the past. It provided the ultimate nuance. The distant smell of temple incense might suggest a year of deep religious significance. The scent of specific burnt offerings could pinpoint a particular festival or ritual. The aroma of a peculiar type of wood might recall a crisis where that wood was used for pyres or for rebuilding, locking a specific memory into the very dust. Training to become a reader was an arduous, all-consuming process. A young apprentice would spend years of their life blindfolded. Their entire world would shrink to the sensations in their fingertips and the subtle scents in their nostrils. They would learn to identify entire eras of the kingdom's history by feel and smell alone, discerning the reign of a peaceful king from the texture of his era's ash or the scent of a great famine from the dust it left behind. The final test was a moment of pure drama and tension. The master reader would lead the blindfolded apprentice deep into the quiet heart of the archive. Then he would remove the blindfold. The student, blinking in the low light, would be surrounded by thousands of silent urns. The master would point to one, unmarked and anonymous among the countless others. "Read this year," he would command. The apprentice would step forward, their heart pounding. They would carefully unseal the urn and take a small pinch of the ash within. They would rub it between their thumb and forefinger, feeling its every grain. They would bring it to their nose, inhaling its ancient, faded scent. And then they would speak. They would have to paint a picture of the year to tell its story. This was a year, the apprentice might begin, that started in conflict. I feel the grit here, the sharp edges of unrest, but it ended in a hard-won peace. See how this coarse, black ash at the very bottom gives way to this finer, lighter grey on top. The transition is clear, and there is a scent. Cedar, faint, but it's there. A treaty was signed in the Cedar Hall. The master reader would listen, unmoving. The accuracy of this reading, when checked against the kingdom's meticulously kept oral histories, would determine the apprentice's entire future, their fitness to carry the immense responsibility of being a reader of the ash. Let's just pause here for a moment. The fire in our own hearth crackles gently, and the night breathes quietly around us. Try to imagine that place. A silent, dusty library, not of scrolls and ink, but of urns filled with the remnants of time. A history that cannot be simply read with the eyes, but must be felt with the hands and smelled with the nose to be truly understood. A record that engages the whole body, the whole person, not just the intellect. It's a testament to a different kind of intelligence, one deeply connected to the physical world, to sensation, and to the subtle echoes of the past. This unique system created a continuous, living feedback loop for the kingdom. The Great Fire witnessed the events of the year and produced the ash, the raw data of history. The readers then interpreted that ash, weaving the colors, textures, and scents into a coherent narrative of the past. But this narrative wasn't just for dusty records. It actively informed the present. It guided the king, the council, and the people. If the ash from the last few years began showing a consistent trend towards that gritty texture and that dull, charcoal grey color, the elders and the master reader would see a warning. They might counsel the king that a period of national introspection and reconciliation was needed to deliberately steer the kingdom back towards the white ash of harmony and contentment. The past, held in its most fragile and ephemeral form, was not a dead thing. It was an active, living counsel for the future, a constant guide whispering warnings and encouragement from the dust of generations. This was how they ensured that the lessons of yesterday were never forgotten, but were instead used to build a better tomorrow. Let's step into a world where history isn't written in books, but is captured in something far more elemental, something you can touch and smell. Imagine a library where every shelf is lined not with scrolls, but with urns. This is the ash archives of Meroë, a civilization that recorded its entire history in the ashes of a sacred, ever-burning flame. Every event, every decision, every collective emotion of the people was offered to this fire. The resulting ash, carefully collected and stored, became the most profound historical record imaginable. It wasn't just a chronicle of events, it was a library of feelings, a tactile archive of the kingdom's soul. Each urn held a year, a season, a single moment of triumph or sorrow, preserved for eternity. How could mere ash tell such a complex story? The secret lay in what was burned. Specific woods, herbs, spices, and offerings were chosen to represent the nature of an event. The color, the texture, the scent, even the weight of the ash told a story far richer than any words on a page. It was a language of substance and sensation. To truly understand this, let's witness a lesson in progress. In the heart of the archives, surrounded by the silent testament of centuries, sits the master reader, an old man named Eric Kamanator. His face is a map of time itself, his eyes holding the wisdom of 1,000 fires. With him is his newest apprentice, a young boy named Shorkara, his eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. The air is thick with the scent of old clay and a faint, ever-present hint of smoke. Today's lesson is about a golden age, the reign of the great queen Amenhotep, who ruled a century before their time. Auric doesn't reach for a dusty scroll or a heavy tome. Instead, he turns to the wall of urns, his practiced hand scanning the rows of terracotta. He stops and with a gentle motion retrieves a specific vessel. It's marked with a symbol that gleams in the low light, a sun disk hovering over a pyramid. This emblem signifies power, divinity, and a connection to the heavens. He hands the urn to the boy. It feels cool and solid in Shorkara's small hands. This, Eric says, his voice a low, resonant hum, is the 7th year of her reign, the year of the Punt expedition. Open it, Shorkara, holding his breath, carefully lifts the lid. The sight that greets him is astonishing. The ash inside is a remarkable pale gold, shimmering as if it holds its own internal light. It's finer than any sand or powdered chalk he has ever seen. As he leans closer, a faint, sweet scent of myrrh and spice rises to meet him, a fragrance of distant lands and precious goods. It feels joyous, the boy whispers, his voice filled with awe. He runs a finger through the ash, feeling its impossible softness, its warmth. It's like touching solidified happiness. Eric smiles, a gentle, knowing expression. Not just joyous, he corrects softly, triumphant, but a gentle triumph. Not the harsh victory of war, but the sweet success of peace. He gestures towards the urn. The gold color you see comes from the sandalwood of the tribute ships. They were burned in offering upon their return, a sign of immense gratitude and prosperity. The fineness of the ash tells us the venture was flawlessly executed. There is no grit of error, no coarse sand of conflict or mistake. And the myrrh scent that tells us it was a trade mission, not a war. Myrrh is the scent of exchange, of diplomacy, of shared wealth. He lets the lesson settle in the boy's mind. The ash tells us not just what they did, but how they did it. With precision, with grace, and with fragrant diplomacy. This wasn't just a successful expedition. It was a masterpiece of statecraft, and the memory of it is held perfectly in this golden dust. Shorkara looks from the ash to his master, a profound understanding dawning on his face. This wasn't just history. It was a living emotion he could hold in his hands. But history is never just a string of golden years. A wise leader must understand adversity as well as triumph. Eric turns back to the shelf. From the same queen's reign, he selects another urn. This one is different. It's marked with the stark symbol of a drooping plant, an image of thirst and withering life. And this, he says, his tone shifting from warmth to solemnity, this is the 15th year, the year of the short drought. He places this urn in Shorkara's other hand. The boy immediately feels a difference. Feel its weight, Eric instructs. It is heavier. It holds worry. Shorkara nods. The urn feels dense, sorrowful. He opens it. The ash inside is a stark contrast to the first. It's a reddish-brown color, and it's slightly clumpy, not smooth and fine. It smells of dust and something vaguely salty, like dried tears. The red, Eric explains, his voice low, is the dust of the parched fields, offered to the fire in desperate prayer. The fields were literally burning under the sun, and so their very soil was given to the flame. The clumps, they represent the tears of the people, metaphorically falling into the fire of their prayers, binding the ash with their collective grief. The boy feels a chill despite the warmth of the archives. He can almost hear the prayers, feel the desperation of a people watching their crops fail. He can feel the weight of a kingdom's anxiety in the palm of his hand. It's a heavy burden. But then Eric leans closer, his finger pointing to the very top of the ash in the urn. "But see here," he says, his voice lifting slightly. "Look at the very top layer." Shorkara squints and sees a thin, distinct stratum of white ash resting atop the darker, clumpier red-brown. It's like a layer of fresh snow on winter earth. "The drought broke," Eric declares, a note of pride in his voice. "The Queen's wisdom found water. She organized the people to dig new canals, to find deeper wells. The white ash represents the relief, the purity of the returning rains, the clean slate of a crisis averted. The story is in the layers." He looks directly at the boy, impressing the lesson upon him. A good rain is not one of only white ash. That is a fantasy. A truly great rain is one where the darker layers, the red and grey ashes of hardship, are always overcome. It's a rain where a layer of white can always be found at the top. Shorkara carefully pours some of the layered ash onto a white cloth. The story is laid bare, a thick base of reddish-brown worry topped by a clean, hopeful line of white. Hardship and resolution captured in dust. This was the ultimate purpose of the Ash Archives. It was designed to teach nuance. It was a powerful statement against simplistic views of the past. History was not a simple parade of good and bad years, not just a list of kings and battles. It was a complex, interwoven tapestry of challenges and responses, of sorrow and joy, of fear and courage. The ash preserved the quality of an era, its emotional and moral temperature. By studying it, the future leaders of Meroë were not just learning facts from a textbook. They were learning the very texture of good governance. They were learning the scent of wise diplomacy, the color of a united people, the weight of a shared burden, and the lightness of collective relief. This wasn't history as a subject. It was history as a tactile, sensory, moral philosophy designed to build empathy and wisdom in those who would one day lead. It was a way of ensuring that the lessons of the past were not just remembered, but felt deep in the bones. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the scene, the gentle crackle of the fire as the night breathes around them, the profound lesson held in that urn. History not as a list of victories, but as a narrative of resilience. The past preserved as dust, teaching the future how to endure, how to overcome, how to strive to leave a finer, whiter ash for those who will one day sift through the record of our own days. It's a beautiful, powerful concept, a way of connecting generations through the most fundamental of elements. This exquisite, fragile system of memory, this culture built around an ever-burning flame and its layered residue, was the very heart of Meroë. But such a unique and profound tradition would eventually face its ultimate test. Not from drought or internal conflict, which it knew how to record and learn from, but from an outside force. A force that did not speak the subtle language of ash. A force that would see the sacred flame not as a witness to history, but as a target. Not as a historian, but as a trophy to be extinguished. The greatest story in the Ash Archives was yet to be written, and it would be a story of fire against fire. For centuries, the flame had been a constant companion in the temple's solemn gloom. It was a steady, golden orange eye, its color only ever shifting slightly with the quality of the siseb wood fed to it, or the particular intensity of a ceremony. Its flicker, its dance, its warmth. This was a familiar text, a language the keepers of Meroë had understood for generations. Its behavior was as predictable as the rising of the sun. So, when the change came, it wasn't a subtle shift or a minor variation. It was a profound, world-shattering violation of reality itself. It began during the evening watch. The keeper on duty, a man named Nasterson, was performing his nightly ritual. He was carefully feeding the flame a freshly cut log, one that had been lovingly anointed with fragrant frankincense oil. This was a task he had done 1,000 times before. As the new wood caught, he expected the familiar, welcoming flare of gold. But that's not what happened. Instead, the fire erupted with a cold, eerie, blue-green light. The very heart of the flame pulsed with a ghostly, unnatural green, while its edges flickered a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Nasterson stumbled backward, the air catching in his throat. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, convinced he was seeing things, perhaps a trick of the smoke or his own tired mind. But when he looked again, the green persisted. It was stark, undeniable, and utterly alien. This wasn't a trick of the light. The eternal flame of Meroë, the sacred heart of their faith, was burning the color of tarnished copper. It was the color of stagnant marsh water, the color of a festering bruise on the sky just before a devastating hailstorm. It was a color of decay, not life. Panic seized him. He turned and ran, his sandals slapping against the cool stone floor, his voice hoarse as he called for the other keepers. They came running, drawn by the terror in his cries. One by one, they entered the chamber and stopped dead. Forming a circle of stunned, disbelieving faces, all of them painted in that alien, chilling glow. No one had ever seen this. No one had even heard a story, not a whisper in the darkest corner of their history that mentioned such a thing. The flame was gold. It was always gold. The master reader, the keeper of their history, was summoned from the vast ash archive where the oldest records were kept. He was a man whose life was dedicated to the study of the flame's past, poring over brittle papyrus scrolls and reciting the oral histories passed down through countless generations. He searched frantically, his fingers tracing ancient scripts, his mind racing through the epics and prophecies. He found nothing. There was no mention, no hint, no allegory of a green flame. This event was completely outside of all recorded memory, outside of all language in their extensive lexicon of fire. For 3 days and 3 nights, the flame burned on. It didn't flicker or wane. It just held its terrifying, constant green. A silent, electric dread settled over the temple, thick and suffocating. The green light seemed to suck the warmth right out of the ancient stones, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls like accusing spirits. Worshippers who came to pay their respects would enter, see the monstrous light, and retreat in frightened whispers, their prayers dying on their lips. The keepers, unsure of what to do, stopped adding wood, but the strange flame didn't need it. It burned steadily on the old, blackened coals, an unchanging, silent, screaming anomaly at the center of their world. It was a question being asked in a language they couldn't comprehend. On the morning of the 4th day, the High Keeper, an aged man named Talakamani, knew he could wait no longer. His face was a map of wrinkles, each line earned through decades of service and contemplation. He understood the philosophy of the flame better than anyone. It was a living oracle, and an unknown word from the fire was the most dire message of all. It meant an event was coming for which they had no precedent, no rituals, no preparation. The gods were speaking about something new, something terrible, and he had to interpret it. So, Talakamani did the only thing he could. He went to the flame alone. He sat before the brazier, crossing his legs in the ancient meditative posture. He closed his eyes and tried to attune his spirit to the fire, to listen not with his ears, but with his soul. He felt its strange heat, a coldness that seemed to burn, and he focused on the color, green. What did green mean? He let his mind drift, searching for connections. Green, it was the color of verdigris, the patina that grew on bronze, a sign of age and corruption. Green, the color of distant, fertile lands to the north, beyond the familiar desert sands. But it was also the color of envy, of poison, of new, unnatural growth that chokes the life from healthy plants. He sat there for hours, a silent sentinel before the silent, verdant fire, assembling the pieces of this terrifying puzzle. Finally, he rose. His joints ached, but his mind was clear. He had found an answer. It was a grim and frightening one, but it was an answer nonetheless. He assembled his fellow keepers, who had been waiting with bated breath. They gathered around him, their faces full of fear and hope, illuminated by the same unsettling light. Talakamani's voice, when he finally spoke, was grave, carrying the weight of his revelation. The flame burns with the color of metal, he announced, his words echoing in the hushed chamber. Not our sacred gold or the warm copper we know. It is a foreign metal, a cold metal. This green is its voice. He paused, letting the words sink in. The other keepers looked at each other, confusion warring with fear on their faces. The flame is cold, he continued, his gaze fixed on the unnatural fire. It speaks of a threat that approaches not from the desert to our east or the southern kingdoms we know. It comes from the north, from the lands where they work iron and bronze with clever, cold hands. This is not a raid by nomads or a dispute with a neighbor. His voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a certainty that was more terrifying than any shout. It is a warning. A metallic doom is coming. An army unlike any we have faced, and they will be here before the moon is full again. A profound silence fell over the keepers, broken only by the cold, green, silent hiss of the eternal flame. The prophecy had been spoken. Now, all they could do was wait for the clank of foreign metal on the horizon. Armed with this terrifying interpretation, the High Keeper Talakamani requested an immediate audience with King Arametelko. He was ushered through the grand corridors of the royal palace in Meroë, the heart of the Kushite kingdom, his old bones moving with a speed that belied his age. The throne room was a cavern of power, echoing with the confidence of an empire at its peak. He was brought before the throne, a magnificent seat of carved ebony and inlaid ivory. The king, Arametelko, sat upon it, a proud warrior in his prime. His muscles were honed by years of training and battle, his gaze sharp and direct. He was surrounded by his most trusted generals and advisors, men who, like him, trusted in the tangible strength of spears, shields, and the mighty walls of their city. They looked at the priest with a mixture of respect and impatience, their minds on military drills and trade routes, not on temple mysteries. The king listened, his patience wearing thin as the old priest Talakamani described the omen he had witnessed in the great temple. The fire of Apedmark has turned the color of sickness, of northern metal, Talakamani said. His voice, usually steady and resonant from years of chanting, trembled now, not with fear, but with the immense weight of the message he carried. It burns a warning, O king, a great danger approaches. An invasion comes from the north, the Persians, perhaps, or another powerful foe. They are almost upon us. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. We must prepare not just our armies, but our spirits. We must make urgent sacrifices to appease the gods and strengthen our resolve. We must fortify the temple, the spiritual heart of our kingdom, and most importantly, we must send the archives to safety. The histories, the knowledge, the soul of our people must be preserved. King Arametelko leaned back on his throne, a gesture of casual dismissal. He had little time or patience for the temple's arcane mysteries and prophecies. His reign, his power, his entire worldview was built on the tangible, the measurable, the visible strength of Meroë. He dealt in numbers of troops, quantities of tribute from vassal states, and the undeniable reality of the city's towering walls and fortified granaries. "Old man," he said, his tone not entirely unkind, but firm and final, leaving no room for debate. "The fire is fed by wood, is it not? Perhaps the siseb grove from which we gather the sacred logs is diseased. Perhaps a strange resin from a new plant has accidentally entered the brazier. These are simple, earthly explanations." He gestured to the vastness beyond the palace walls. "My scouts, the best in all of Nubia, patrol the northern wastes day and night. They have seen nothing. No dust clouds of approaching armies, no warning signals from our frontier posts. There is silence on the border. You speak of strange colors in a flame, while I must deal with the realities of stone and steel, of logistics and supply lines." The generals flanking the throne murmured their agreement. Their world was one of clear commands and battlefield tactics. The priests' talk of portents felt like a distraction from the real work of defending the kingdom. One of them, a grizzled veteran with scars mapping his face, let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Shall we fear the shade of a fire more than the sworn report of our own eyes?" he muttered to his neighbor, just loud enough for the court to hear. Talakamani's desperation grew. These were men of action, blind to the currents of fate that he could so clearly see swirling in the ethereal flame. He clasped his hands together, his knuckles white. "The flame has been our sacred witness for 800 years. It has chronicled our triumphs and our sorrows. It has never lied. It saw the rise of our dynasty, the defeat of the Assyrians, the great floods of the Nile. It does not see with human eyes. It sees with the soul of time itself. Please, my king, I implore you, heed its word." His plea echoed in the high-ceilinged chamber, a desperate cry against a wall of skepticism. But the king's mind was made up. He saw the priest's warning not as a divine message, but as the superstitious panic of old men who spent too much time in smoky, incense-filled rooms, their minds clouded by ritual and tradition. He had a kingdom to run, and there was no place in his strategy for green flames. He dismissed Talakamani with a final, impatient wave of his hand. "Tend your fire, priest. That is your duty. Let me tend my kingdom. That is mine. If an army comes, my armies will meet it. I have faith in our strength, in our courage. Your green flame is not a weapon I recognize, and it is not one I will rely on." The finality in the king's voice was like a physical blow. Guards stepped forward, their movements polite but firm, to usher the High Keeper from the royal presence. As they guided him away, Talakamani's shoulders slumped in defeat. He cast one last look back at the throne. He saw not a foolish king, but a tragic one, so confident in his material strength that he was deaf to the whispers of destiny. His gaze was filled with a profound, prophetic sorrow for the king, for the generals, and for the entire kingdom of Meroë. The High Keeper returned to the great temple, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. The sun felt colder, the familiar sounds of the city distant and hollow. The sacred covenant, the ancient pact between the rulers and the gods, was breaking. The kingdom, in its pride and power, was refusing to listen to its own history, its own spiritual memory. The flame's message, the most urgent and terrifying in its long 800-year history, was falling on the deaf ears of the present. He gathered the other keepers of the flame in the sanctum. They were a brotherhood of scholars and priests, their faces etched with the same concern he felt. They saw the truth in his eyes before he even spoke. "The king will not listen," Talakamani announced, his voice low and heavy. "The warning is ours alone to bear. The court sees us as relics, our wisdom as superstition." He looked around at the faces of his brethren, at the sacred texts lining the walls, at the green fire still burning balefully in the central brazier. A grim resolve settled over him. Our duty has changed. It is no longer to prevent the coming disaster. That moment has passed. The gears of fate are turning, and the king has chosen his path. Our duty now is to ensure the record survives it. The knowledge, the history, the light of our civilization must not be extinguished. He pointed a trembling finger toward the eerie green glow. The flame has seen its own end. It has shown us the coming darkness. And so, we must prepare the ash. We must prepare to save the seed of Meroë, so that, from the ashes of what is to come, something new may one day grow. Their new, secret mission had begun. Not to save the kingdom, but to save its memory from the fires of war that the king refused to see. For 3 days, the green flame burned, an emerald spectre against the temple's ancient stone. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Not a flicker, not a fade. It was an instant, silent, snuffing out, as if a cosmic hand had pinched its very heart. The temple of Apedmark was thrown into a darkness deeper than any night, a void that echoed with a single horrifying truth. The unthinkable had happened. The eternal flame was dead. In that profound, crushing darkness, you might expect to hear weeping, the sounds of despair. But the keepers of the flame did not weep. Their grief was a sharp, cold stone in their chests. But their actions were precise. A grim ballet practiced for a disaster they had prayed would never come. This was the moment their entire lives, and the lives of all keepers before them, had prepared them for. Ordinary oil lamps were hastily lit, their flickering, yellow light casting long, dancing shadows across the sacred space. The familiar, warm glow was a pale imitation of the eternal green, a mundane light for a mundane, terrible task. The final protocol had begun. The master reader, his face a mask of resolute sorrow, led his apprentices to the ash archives. This hallowed library, holding the entire history of Meroë in countless urns of ash, was about to be the urns themselves, each a unique artifact holding the remains of a specific moment, a specific reign, a specific memory, were too many, too fragile to transport. Taking them would be impossible. So, the keepers began a different kind of collection. With small, silver scoops, they moved from urn to urn, their movements swift and reverent. From this one, a pinch of snow-white ash, the memory of a peaceful king's long reign. From that one, a clump of jet-black residue, the chronicle of a bitter war. Over here, a dusting of sparkling grey, the record of a famine and the resilience that followed. Each scoop was a whisper of history, a condensed chapter of a grand epic. These disparate memories, these ashes of triumphs and tragedies, were all poured together, mixed into a single, large ceremonial vessel carved from pure alabaster. This vessel, known as the Shesh, now held something new. It wasn't just a collection, it was a synthesis. The stratified, ordered memory of Meroïtic history was now blended, unified, a single testament to a people and their journey through time. Once filled, the Shesh was sealed with dark wax, and the master reader whispered a curse upon any who would dare to open it without the proper reverence, without understanding the weight of the history held within. But one task remained, the final and most sacred duty of all. It fell to Talakamani, the master reader. He approached the great bronze brazier, now cold and dark, at the temple's heart. With a pair of bronze tongs, he reached into the very center where the flame had died. He carefully scooped up the still warm ash that carried a faint, ghostly green tinge. This was the ash of the warning itself, the final, dreadful entry in their long chronicle. This he did not mix with the others. This ash was unique, a coda, the explanation for the end. He placed it carefully into a small, simple, unadorned clay urn. Its plainness spoke volumes. Carrying both vessels, the large, ornate alabaster shesh, holding the whole of their history, and the small, plain clay urn, holding the story of its Entelakmani, walked to the altar of Apidmark, the lion-headed god of war and protection. With ritual words that were both a prayer and a final, heartbreaking farewell, he placed the two vessels into a deep, stone-lined pit that had been prepared beneath the massive altar stone. He sealed the pit with rubble and dust, hiding the soul of his civilization from the coming storm. His face in the lamplight was serene. His duty was complete. The memory of Meroë was now safe, buried in the heart of its most sacred place. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, the dust clouds finally appeared. The king's scouts, for all their vigilance, had failed to see them. They rose on the northern horizon, a harbinger of doom. The Persian army, led by a notoriously ruthless commander, had done the impossible. They had marched with terrifying speed and utter secrecy across the harsh desert, a silent, unstoppable wave of conquest. The assault on the great city of Meroë was swift and brutal. The legendary walls, which had stood for centuries, were breached in hours. The royal palace, a symbol of Nubian power, fell amidst fire and screams. The temple of Apedmak, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, was a key target. To the invaders, it was just another symbol of defiance, to be erased, a source of treasure to be plundered. When the Persian soldiers, their swords still stained with the blood of the city's defenders, burst through the temple doors, they expected to find gold, jewels, and priests begging for their lives. What they found stopped them in their tracks. There was no treasure glinting in the morning light. There were only old men, the keepers of the flame, standing in a silent, unbroken circle around the cold, empty brazier. Their hands were empty. Their faces showed no fear, only a profound, unshakable calm. They were not guarding treasure. They were standing guard over a pile of dead ash. The Persian commander, a man of war and plunder, was confused, disappointed even. This was not the victory he had envisioned. There was no glory here, only old men and dust. In a fit of frustrated rage, he gave the order. Put the temple to the torch. And so, a new fire was introduced to the temple of Apedmak. A loud, orange, ignorant flame. It cared nothing for the history carved into the walls, for the prayers soaked into the stones. It climbed the great wooden pillars, consuming the ancient carvings of gods and kings. It licked at the sacred tapestries, turning centuries of art into smoke. The last sight of the keepers was not one of struggle. They remained in their circle as the roof above them groaned and crackled. They did not move. They did not cry out. They simply stood together, a silent testament to a duty fulfilled. As the foreign fire roared, the massive roof collapsed, bringing down tons of stone and burning timber. The temple became their tomb. The keepers and their extinguished witness, the dead eternal flame, were buried together. The profane ash of the burning mingled with the sacred ash they had spent their entire lives curating, a final, tragic union. Let's just pause here for a moment. Think about that. The fire crackles gently in our own time as the night breathes around us. Can you feel that final, terrible silence in the temple? The duty of the keepers shifting in an instant from lifelong preservation to a final, desperate burial. The entire history of a proud and ancient kingdom, a civilization that had rivaled Egypt, condensed into two small vessels and hidden under the very stones that were about to fall and entomb them. It's a complete and utterly tragic circle. A story of how a history can be saved, even as the people who made it are lost. It's a reminder that what we leave behind, the stories we bury, might one day be found again. Imagine, for centuries, the city of Meroë lay hidden, swallowed by the desert sands. An entire civilization, a kingdom of black pharaohs, vanished from memory. When European explorers stumbled upon it, they found a surreal landscape of mysterious pyramids, sharp-edged sentinels against the endless dunes. But the true story of Meroë was still buried. It wasn't until the 20th century that systematic archaeology began to peel back the layers of time. Our story begins with one such team. Led by a brilliant and meticulous British-Sudanese archaeologist, Dr. Iman Hassan, they were working at the Temple of Aped Mark, dedicated to the lion-headed god of war. They had already made significant progress, clearing the grand main hall and unearthing statues and inscriptions that whispered tales of a powerful dynasty. But the greatest mystery was yet to be found. Not in the grand hall, but in a small, unassuming side chamber near the altar. Here, the team discovered something that defied all convention. Carved directly into the bedrock floor were a series of neat, rectangular pits. At first glance, one might think they were graves, but they were too orderly, too clean, and lacked any human remains. Instead of dirt, they were filled with something far more intriguing. Stratified layers of different-colored ash. The layers were incredibly distinct. A thick band of brilliant white, followed by a thin, sharp line of black, then a layer of rich, reddish-brown, more white, and so on. It was like looking at a geological cross-section, but this was undeniably man-made. Scattered beside these strange pits were fragments of finely crafted ceramic urns. Dr. Iman Hassan knelt beside one of the pits, her sun hat casting a shadow over her face as she carefully brushed at the exposed layers. The dust danced in the slivers of light piercing the ruined temple roof. Her team watched, a mixture of confusion and excitement on their faces. "It's not a midden," Dr. Hassan said, her voice soft but clear in the echoing silence of the chamber. A midden is essentially ancient trash, a random pile of refuse. This was the opposite of random. They didn't just dump hearth ash here, she continued, thinking aloud. This is curated, layered. It's an archive of ash. The idea was completely bizarre, almost nonsensical. What kind of information could possibly be stored in burnt remains? What events, what history could these colored layers represent? It was a puzzle unlike any other. The Meroë script itself is only partially deciphered, leaving so much of their culture in shadow. Could this be another form of record-keeping, one that archaeologists had never even conceived of? The team was stumped, but Dr. Hassan was energized by the challenge. This wasn't just a dig anymore. It was the unfolding of an ancient enigma. The pits were a silent testament, a library of fire, waiting for someone to learn its language. The team documented everything with painstaking precision, but the pits themselves offered no immediate answers. The real breakthrough, the clue that would unlock the secret of the Ash Archive, was waiting for them just a few feet away. The main altar of the temple, a massive slab of stone, lay fractured and askew, a victim of time and perhaps ancient looters. Driven by a hunch, Dr. Hassan decided they needed to see what was underneath. It was a monumental effort, requiring levers and the combined strength of the entire team to shift the immense weight of the broken stone. As the final piece of the altar was lifted away, a collective gasp went through the team. There, nestled in a perfectly carved stone cyst, lay two vessels, miraculously preserved and untouched for millennia. One was a stunning alabaster jar, its smooth, white surface gleaming in the dim light, its lid sealed with ancient resin. The other was a simple clay urn, humble and unadorned, a stark contrast to its elegant companion. With the utmost care, as if handling the most fragile of artifacts, they were lifted from their resting place and transported to the makeshift field laboratory set up in a large tent nearby. The desert sun beat down outside, but inside the tent, under the bright glare of work lights, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The team gathered around, holding their breath. This was the moment. Dr. Hassan, her hands steady as a surgeon's, took up her fine tools. All eyes were on the beautiful alabaster vessel as she began to carefully, meticulously break the ancient seal. What treasures would they find? Gold, jewels, a king's ransom. As the lid was finally lifted, a wave of anticlimax swept over some of the younger team members. Inside was not gold or shimmering gems. It was ash, just more ash. But this ash was different from the neatly layered pits. It was a uniform, greyish powder, a complete blend of countless different colors, all mixed into a homogeneous whole. To the untrained eye, it was disappointing. A beautiful, sealed jar full of dust. But Dr. Hassan saw something more. Their attention then turned to the simple clay urn. It was unsealed. As they opened it, the contrast was immediate and startling. The ash inside was a peculiar greenish-grey color, a shade they hadn't seen in the stratified pits or the blended vessel. And its structure was also unique. It wasn't a uniform powder. It was layered, but in a completely different way. At the bottom was a dense, dark layer. But sitting on top of that was something truly strange. A layer of crystalline green material that sparkled under the lab lights. It looked almost like crushed glass or some unknown mineral. Dr. Hassan knew this was the key. She immediately began taking samples of everything. Samples from each distinct colored layer in the pits in the temple chamber. A sample from the blended greyish powder in the grand alabaster jar. And multiple samples from the strange, two-tiered contents of the humble clay urn. Each sample was carefully labeled and sealed. The materials were then flown to a state-of-the-art materials science laboratory in London, a world away from the sun-baked Sudanese desert. Back in London, the analysis began. The results that came back were astonishing, revealing a level of scientific sophistication that no one had ever attributed to the Meroitic civilization. The colored ash from the pits. It wasn't just colored ash. Each color corresponded to a specific type of plant, burned at a very specific and controlled temperature. The white ash came from burning papyrus reeds, the source of their paper. The black ash was from acacia wood, a tree fundamental to their environment and construction. The reddish-brown ash was derived from burning sorghum grain, their staple food source. This wasn't just an archive. It was a meticulously catalogued record of their resources. Each layer represented a year's tribute or harvest, a physical ledger of the kingdom's wealth. Then came the analysis of the blended ash from the alabaster jar. The lab confirmed Dr. Hassan's theory. The grey powder contained trace elements from every single type of ash found in the pits. It was a master sample, a symbolic combination of the entire kingdom's resources, sealed in a precious vessel and placed under the main altar. It was likely a sacred offering, a representation of the whole nation, the sum of all its parts, presented to their god, Mark. But the most mind-blowing revelation came from the simple clay urn. The analysis of the greenish-grey ash was completely unexpected. The dark layer at the bottom was, as suspected, ash. But it was the ash of a very specific desert plant known for its high metal content. The top layer, the crystalline green substance, it wasn't a mineral, it was a crude form of glass. The Meroitic priests, the keepers of this temple, had discovered a primitive form of vitrification. Here's what the scientists pieced together. The priests would burn the metal-rich plant, creating a specific type of ash. They would then place this ash in the clay urn and subject it to intense, focused heat. They had essentially created a rudimentary furnace. The heat was just enough to cause the silicates and metallic oxides in the ash to melt and fuse together. When it cooled, it formed a layer of green glass on top of the remaining unmelted ash. Why would they do this? The answer lay in the very nature of an archive. The ash in the pits was vulnerable. A flood, a strong wind, or just the passage of time could disturb the layers and destroy the record. But by turning the ash into glass, they were making it permanent. They were transforming a fragile record of a year's resources into a solid, incorruptible artifact. The clay urn found under the altar wasn't just an object. It was a demonstration of a groundbreaking technology. It was a proof of concept, a patent for preserving their history forever. Dr. Hassan and her team had stumbled upon something incredible. The Temple of Apedmark wasn't just a place of worship. It was a center for science, an archive and a laboratory. The priests were not just religious figures, they were librarians, chemists, and engineers. They had developed a system of data storage using ash and a method of permanent data preservation through vitrification, thousands of years before the modern digital age. The forgotten city of Meroë had given up one of its most profound secrets. It wasn't a story of gold or power, but a story of human ingenuity and the timeless desire to record our existence, to make our mark, and to ensure that our story is not simply blown away by the sands of time. This discovery completely rewrote our understanding of Meroitic culture, revealing a scientific legacy as impressive as their pyramids. To unravel the secrets of the Meroë kingdom, samples of the stratified ash were carefully packed and sent to laboratories across the globe. What came back was not a single, sudden eureka moment, but a slow dawning, breathtaking revelation. Radiocarbon dating was the first step. Tiny flecks of charcoal embedded within the ash layers acted like microscopic clocks, allowing scientists to establish a clear timeline. The results were astounding. The stratified pits, with their distinct layers of ash, contained deposits spanning nearly 800 years. This timeline perfectly matched the known duration of the Meroë kingdom, from its rise to its eventual decline. It was the first solid piece of evidence that this wasn't just a random garbage heap, it was a chronicle. But the real story, the rich, detailed narrative, was hidden in the chemistry. Chemical analysis of the ash layers began to peel back the centuries, revealing a story far more intricate than anyone had dared to imagine. The team started with the clean, white ash layers. Analysis showed them to be almost pure calcium carbonate. This is the chemical signature of ash from clen burning. Dry wood, incinerated at high temperatures. It pointed to periods when fuel was plentiful and the fires were well maintained. These were the layers the ancient keepers had called the ash of peace. And now, modern science was confirming their intuition. These layers correlated perfectly with historical records of stability, prosperity, and strong trade within the kingdom. Next, they turned their attention to the dark, coarse layers, the black ash of war. The results were starkly different. These layers contained unusually high levels of potassium and phosphorus. These are elements strongly associated with the burning of organic materials like bone, leather, and even animal dung. It painted a grim picture of conflict and siege, times when proper fuel was scarce and the people were forced to burn whatever they could find to survive. The fires of war, it turned out, left a literal chemical stain on the historical record. A residue of strife and desperation that was chemically complex and distinct. Then there were the reddish-brown layers, which the keepers had linked to hardship and famine. The analysis revealed they were rich in iron oxide. This wasn't from the fire itself, but from the world outside. It was, quite literally, rust-colored desert dust. During periods of prolonged drought, the winds would have whipped up the desert sands, carrying fine silt that contaminated everything: the water, the food, and, of course, the fuel for the sacred fires. The fires would have burned less efficiently, choked with dust, leaving behind this telltale reddish-brown residue. The priest's ash of sorrow was the chemical footprint of climate change and environmental struggle. Perhaps most visually striking under the microscope were the sparkling grey layers. These were the ash of celebration. Chemical analysis showed they contained microscopic particles of malachite, gold, lapis lazuli, and other minerals. These were not naturally occurring in the fuel. These were the remnants of pigments, ceremonial objects, and offerings deliberately added to the fire during religious festivals and royal ceremonies. The kingdom's moments of greatest joy and reverence were literally preserved as glittering specks within the ash, a shimmering record of their culture and faith. But the most astonishing discovery came from the small, sealed urn found separate from the main archive. The green ash inside was unlike anything else. It contained unusually high levels of copper salts. When certain copper salts are burned, they produce a brilliant green flame. But there was more. The analysis also detected a specific organic compound from a rare desert plant. When this particular plant is burned, it too is known to produce a vibrant green flame. The combination was unique, a specific recipe. The dating of this ash placed it at the very end of the Meroitic period, a time that coincided precisely with the historical accounts of the Persian invasion. This wasn't just another entry. It felt like a final statement. The correlations were undeniable, almost poetic in their precision. The ash record was not random. It was a structured, chemical diary. The keepers of the flame, whether they fully understood the underlying chemistry or not, had been creating a material record of their kingdom's environmental and social history. They were encoding data in the very chemistry of their sacrifices, their fuel, and their rituals. The ancient art of reading the ash by its texture, its color, and its feel was not just superstition. It was a brilliant, intuitive form of chemical analysis. Their white ash of peace was, in fact, chemically pure. Their black ash of war was chemically complex, tainted with the residue of conflict. Their intuitive understanding and our modern science were telling the exact same story, separated by millennia. Let's just pause and think about that for a moment. Picture the scene. A modern, sterile laboratory, filled with humming machines and glowing screens. And on one of those screens, a graph appears. It plots the chemical composition of the ash layers against the historical timeline of Meroë. The lines rise and fall in perfect harmony. Peaks in calcium carbonate match periods of peace. Spikes in potassium and phosphorus align with known wars. The rise of iron oxide mirrors recorded droughts. The connection is visually stunning, immediate and profound. It's a moment of synthesis where ancient intuition meets modern instrumentation, and they find they have been speaking the same language all along. The priest's poetry, phrases like ash of conflict or ash of sorrow, were not metaphors. They were empirical truths, observations of chemical reality passed down through generations. And this brings us to the final, poignant masterstroke of the keepers. The blended ash in the alabaster vessel, the one they called the shesh. Why mix the archive? Why take this beautifully stratified record and deliberately blend it all together? At first, it seemed like an act of desperation, a chaotic, final gesture. But with the new understanding of the ash's chemical nature, the true genius of their plan became clear. By mixing the archive, the last keepers ensured that if any part of the record survived, it would contain the entirety of their history in microcosm. A single pinch of ash from that vessel contained fragments of every era of the peace, the war, the famine, the celebration. It was the ultimate backup, a condensed genome of their civilization's entire experience. It was an act of profound foresight, ensuring that their story could never be completely erased, as long as a single grain of that blended ash remained. And that small green urn, it was the cover letter. It was the final entry, the explanation for the archive's termination. The unique chemical signature, the copper salts, the rare desert plant, was a specific marker in time. It was the Meroëtic way of signing and dating their final message. A deliberate signal saying, here, at this moment, our story ends. It was a message of closure, a final, defiant flicker of a green flame against the encroaching darkness, preserved for eternity. The keepers didn't just record their history, they curated it, protected it, and in a final, brilliant act, ensured its survival against all odds. Their story wasn't just written in stone or papyrus, but in the very elements of the earth, fire, and time itself. The incredible discovery of the ash archive of Meroë Library, not of books, but of meticulously layered ash, containing the history of a Nubian kingdom, wasn't just a find. It was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the worlds of archaeology and history, igniting a debate as fierce as the fires that created the archive itself. The central question was profound, and it split the academic community down the middle. What, exactly, were the Nubian fire priests doing? On one side, we have what's known as the symbolic school. Their argument is elegant and poetic. They believe the priests were masters of ritual symbolism, creating a grand physical metaphor. For them, the ash wasn't a literal record of history, but a representation of it. Each layer wasn't a snapshot of a year, but a ceremonial reenactment of time's passage. Think of it like a religious service or a theatrical play that tells a story, rather than a documentary that records it. The layering, the different colors, the textures, it was all part of a complex philosophical and theological expression. According to this school of thought, any correlations between the ash layers and actual historical events, like the green layer of ash, corresponding to the year of the plague, were either pure coincidence or more likely a case of us projecting meaning onto it after the fact. We find a story in the patterns because we're looking for one. The priests, in this view, were poets, philosophers, and theologians, not scientists in any sense we would recognize. They were speaking in the language of metaphor, not the language of data. They weren't documenting the world. They were interpreting it through a spiritual lens, turning the tangible into the transcendent. But on the other side of this intellectual battlefield stands the empirical school, championed by the brilliant and tenacious Dr. Eris Hassan. Her perspective is radically different. She and her colleagues argue that the symbolic school, while well-intentioned, is fundamentally underestimating the ingenuity of the Nubian priests. Dr. Hassan proposes that these priests were not just poets, they were meticulous empiricists, operating within their own unique cosmological framework. They weren't just creating metaphors, they were recording reality. Her theory is built on a foundation of careful observation and logical deduction. She suggests that, over many generations, the priests noticed something extraordinary. They observed that different kinds of years of peace, years of war, years of drought, years of plenty produced different kinds of ash when they performed their rituals. It started as a simple observation. For instance, a year of war would naturally involve more burnt offerings of captured weapons and armor, which would add metallic traces to the ash. Sieges would mean burning different types of wood, perhaps from hastily constructed siege towers, which would leave behind complex organic compounds. A drought year would mean the wood they burned was drier and dustier, resulting in a finer, grittier ash. A year of good harvest might involve offerings of grains, leaving a different chemical signature entirely. According to Dr. Hassan, the priests didn't just passively observe this phenomenon, they took it a step further. They began to actively curate it. They started to intentionally tag the ash. During specific events, they would burn specific materials to create a unique, recognizable signature in that year's layer. This wasn't just ritual. It was a deliberate act of encoding information. And this brings us back to that mysterious green flame, the one that coincided with the plague. The symbolic school sees it as a metaphor for sickness or a prayer for healing. But Dr. Hassan sees it as a deliberate, calculated experiment. She posits that the priests intentionally burned a known toxic plant, something that would produce an unmistakable, vibrant green flame and a chemically distinct ash. It was their way of creating an urgent, undeniable signal in their archiver flag in the data that screamed plague. It was a warning, a record, a moment of profound crisis captured forever in the chemical makeup of the dust. This transforms the entire narrative. The priests were no longer just passive observers or spiritual poets. They were active participants in creating their historical record. Their system, Dr. Hassan argues, was a bona fide, pre-modern information technology. Combustion was their encoding process. The fuel and offerings were the data inputs. The flame itself was the processor, transforming the materials. And the ash, the final product, was the redoubt, the hard drive of their civilization. The debate came to a head in an infamous paper published by Dr. Hassan. In it, she delivered a powerful rebuke to the purely symbolic interpretation. She wrote, they were not just watching fire, they were programming it. They used fuel and offerings as data inputs. The flame was the processor. The ash was the readout. This single paragraph reframed the entire conversation. She continued, arguing that their method of reading the ash, which likely involved sight, smell, and even taste, was a form of sophisticated qualitative analysis. We might dismiss it as primitive because it doesn't involve mass spectrometers or digital sensors. But for them, it was a reliable and nuanced way of decoding the information they had so carefully encoded. Dr. Hassan's most profound point was a challenge to our modern biases. She argued that to dismiss their work as mere symbolism is to impose our own Western Cartesian split between the spiritual and the empirical, between science and religion. For the Nubian priests, she insisted, these were not separate categories. They were two sides of the same coin. The divine was in the data, and the data was in the dust. Their science was their spirituality, and their spirituality was their science. They saw the hand of the gods in the chemical reactions, and they saw verifiable truth in the remnants of their sacred fires. What makes this debate so thrilling is that it remains unresolved. There is no final answer, no definitive proof that puts one side completely in the right and the other in the wrong. And that, paradoxically, is its greatest gift. The Ash archive of Meroë doesn't just give us a glimpse into the past. It forces us to expand our very definitions of what constitutes science, technology, and history. The Nubian fire priests, or the keepers of Ash, as they've come to be called, may not have used the double-blind studies or peer review process of the modern scientific method. But they did employ a method. It was systematic, it was repeatable, and it yielded a verifiable, material record of their world. They beautifully blended keen observation of the natural world with deep ritual practice and a complex metaphysical worldview. And they did it to create a coherent system of memory, a way to hold on to their story that survived for millennia against all odds, preserved in the most fragile and ephemeral medium imaginable, ash. Their legacy isn't a simple answer to a historical question. It's a breathtaking new question for us to ponder. It makes us wonder how many other practices from the ancient world, practices we've casually dismissed as symbolic or primitive ritual, were in fact sophisticated technologies of knowledge. Their languages just waiting for us to finally learn how to read them. Imagine walking into a museum today. You move past the grand statues and the glittering gold, and you come to a quiet, dimly lit display case. Inside, on a simple pedestal, sits a beautiful alabaster vessel, the shesh, and next to it, the small, unassuming clay urn that started it all. The placard doesn't just label them as pottery, it describes them as the ash archive of Meroë. And you see the people gathered around, looking at them not just as ancient art or curious artifacts, but as something more. They are looking at profound, enigmatic records. They are looking at a library of fire and time. You can feel the weight of the centuries contained within that dust. The stories of triumph and tragedy, of famine and feast, all encoded in layers of ash. It changes how you see everything. It changes how you see the past. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine we're sitting around a fire, the flames crackling softly, the quiet of the night enveloping us. That's the feeling this discovery leaves you with. It's that respectful silence that follows a truly great question. A question that opens up the world instead of closing it down. It's the sudden, humbling understanding that the past is not a dead and silent thing. It can speak to us, but it speaks in languages we are only now, in the 21st century, beginning to comprehend. The keepers of ash and amber may have lost their sacred flame thousands of years ago. Their kingdom may have vanished into the sands of time, but in the dust they so carefully curated and left behind, they kindled a new fire of wonder, of curiosity, and of inquiry that still burns brightly in the human mind today. It's a fire that reminds us to look closer, to listen harder, and to never assume we have all the answers. And so, the story of the keepers of ash and amber settles into the quiet of the night. Our own small fire reflects in the dark a humble kin to the great, silent witness of Meroë. We have followed the covenant of the eternal flame, a thread of light held taut across 8 centuries. We have walked the ash archives, where history was felt in the palm of a hand and seen in the color of dust. We have felt the chill of the green warning and the tragic weight of a prophecy ignored. And we have stood with modern seekers as they sifted through the residue, finding not just the story of a kingdom's end, but a challenge to our very understanding of how memory can be kept. The Nubian fire priests taught that memory is not a fortress, but a flame. It is dynamic, consuming, transformative, and fragile. It requires constant, vigilant feeding. It leaves a residue that is both the proof of its burning and the condensed essence of what it consumed. Their profound insight was to see this not as a metaphor, but as a literal, operational truth for a civilization. The king ruled the land, but the keepers tended the timeline. In their philosophy, to lose the flame was to lose the self. Think about what that means. In our digital age, we see memory as data, stored on a hard drive, a solid, static thing. We build fortresses of information in the cloud. But for the keepers, memory was a living process. It wasn't about saving a perfect copy. It was about the act of remembering, the ritual of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The flame wasn't just a symbol of their history. It was the engine of their history. Each new log added to the fire represented a new day, a new event, a new story. The act of tending the flame was the act of remembering, and the ash, the fine, seemingly worthless byproduct, was the ultimate record, the compressed data of centuries. The modern discovery of their ash records bridges a vast gap of time and thought. It asks us to listen to the past with more than our eyes and our preconceptions. It suggests that knowledge can be woven into ritual, encoded in chemistry, and preserved in the most ephemeral of substances. The debate between symbol and science is perhaps the wrong question. The keepers would likely have seen no distinction. For them, the spiritual was the empirical. Reading the will of the gods was reading the data of the world. The color of the flame, the texture of the ash, the scent of the smoke, these weren't just mystical signs. They were data points. A change in the wood source might indicate a shift in trade routes or a change in the local ecology. A strange mineral in the ash could point to a new material being used in the kingdom, perhaps a new type of pottery or metalwork. This forces us to reconsider what we define as an archive. We look for libraries, for scrolls, for inscriptions carved in stone. We are trained to see history in text and monument. But the keepers of ash and amber show us that an archive can be a process. A living, breathing tradition that encodes information in action and substance. They were librarians of fire, historians of combustion. Their library wasn't a silent, dusty building. It was a warm, glowing heart at the center of their society. This changes everything. It means that we might be walking past incredible records of lost civilizations without even recognizing them. Ancient rituals that we dismiss as mere superstition could be sophisticated systems of knowledge transfer. The materials they used, the rhythms they followed, the subtle variations they observed. Of it could be part of a language we have yet to decipher. The keepers challenge us to look at the world with new eyes, to see the science within the ceremony and the data within the dust. As the last embers of our fire glow and fade, let us carry the image of the keeper, not as a mysterious mystic, but as a dedicated scholar of process, a watcher who understood that the present is always becoming the past, and that the most sacred duty is to tend that transformation with reverence, so that the light of understanding might continue, and the ash of experience might guide those who come after. They were the ultimate long-term thinkers, dedicating their lives to a project whose true value would only be realized centuries after they were gone. They tended the flame not for themselves, but for the future. For us, their legacy is a powerful reminder. It tells us that what we choose to remember, and how we choose to remember it, defines us. It asks us what flames we are tending today. What are the essential stories, the vital data that we are feeding into our collective memory? And what residue will we leave behind for the archaeologists of the future to find? Will it tell a story of wisdom, of foresight, of a people who understood their place in the long, unfolding story of humanity? Or will it just be the cold, meaningless ash of a fire left untended? The night is deep. The story, written in fire and sealed in ash, is complete. Thank you for joining us. You are under Baobab Skies. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history.